Welcome to St. Peter the Apostle Anglican Church in Kingsport as we continue our series on Anglicanism 101. What is Anglicanism? This morning we are going to talk about probably the most, or if not the most, one of the most significant councils in the Middle Ages, the Fourth Lateran Council. Now, before we start talking about the council per se, it is important to keep in mind the focus of what we're doing in this series. It is not, again, and I've said this 1,000 times, it is not to give a comprehensive overview of English history or even the history of the English Church. It is to lay a backdrop, if you will, against which we can analyze those elements that define what Anglicanism is throughout her history, how we can draw on that information in order to get a better understanding of the full breadth of what Anglicanism is, rather than being limited by one historical time period or another historical time period, which is what the tendency is when one asks somebody what Anglicanism is. You'll see somebody turn around and they'll say, well, it's X, Y, and Z, and that's a 16th century definition of Anglicanism, or they'll say it's A, B, and C. Well, that's a first and second and third century definition of what Anglicanism is. We have to look at Anglicanism in the totality of her history. And we'll get to some of the specifics when we finally get to the Reformation in a couple of weeks. But the Fourth Lateran Council was convened by Pope Innocent III, and it was held in 1215 at the Lateran Palace in Rome. So Lateran is not a city, it is a structure. The council is particularly notable for its wide-ranging reforms and doctrinal definitions that had a profound impact on the Catholic Church as well as medieval Europe. Since this is here, the one on the bottom, do not read until we get to it. Now, the reason that I'm highlighting the Fourth Lateran Council versus any other council, the reason I'm giving it one complete lecture is for this reason. If you'll recall last week, we had a major seismic shift in the relationship between church and state, the English Church, and the papacy. Remember, we had the whole situation with Henry and Beckett, and then his penance, and then what happened with Henry, and then, of course, Richard and John basically abdicates and turns over the English throne and the English Church to Rome. Even with the signing of the Magna Carta and the unfortunate situation that revolved around Stephen Langton and his unceremonious treatment after that issue, the fact remains that at this point, right now, with the Fourth Lateran Council, the English Church is under Roman control. So that's why this council, even though it takes place in Italy, in Rome, becomes so critical to understand what took place in the English Church. The council issued 70 canons. Now, we're not going to go through all 7. We're only going to look at 2. But it issued 70 canons covering doctrine, church reform, and relations with non-Christians. And when you hear what that is, you're going to understand a lot of what happens later on. It took place November 11th through the 30th in 1215. Over 400 bishops, 800 abbots and priors, clerics from all over the empire, representatives of all sorts of governments, to include but not limited to Frederick II, Henry of Constantinople, the King of England, Hungary, Jerusalem, France, et al. So this was a big to-do. It was a comprehensive effort to reform the church, to combat heresy, to affirm doctrine, and to mobilize Christendom, or Christendom, however you want to pronounce that, for the renewed crusading efforts. That actually is a large outworking of this council, the Crusades and the funding for the Crusades. It is considered one of the most important medieval councils due to its wide-ranging impact, and it set the stage for Trent. So I'm going to give you a brief summary of what it was discussing. We're going to talk about two of the elements, and then I'll have you read that handout that I gave you. Okay, so first, church reform. Pope Innocent III aimed to strengthen discipline and morality within the clergy and the laity. Now that should send up red flags. That should trip circuit breakers in your head, because that seems to be a constant refrain. How many times have we come across somebody coming in to reform the church and straighten out the clergy? Stop screwing around. So, clerical celibacy was addressed. Again, simony. Not the person Simon, but the selling of church offices and church influence. The education and conduct of clergy, which became very important. Church administration and order. And the second element is combating heresy. A major concern was the spread of heretical movements, especially the Albigensians. I'm going to give you the easy one. Cathars, C-A-T-H-A-R-S, or Cathari, C-A-T-H-A-R-I, which is from the Greek, the pure ones. And they were concentrated, I should say, in southern France. This particular canon formalized measures for identifying and prosecuting heretics, mandated the creation of inquisitorial procedures, laying the groundwork for the later Inquisition. The third element was doctrine and theology. The council sought to define and clarify important aspects of Catholic doctrine. For example, it affirmed the doctrine of transubstantiation, the belief that the bread and the wine become the actual body and blood of Christ during the Eucharist. Not the real presence, the physical presence. Big difference. The Crusades. Innocent used the council to launch the Fifth Crusade to reclaim the Holy Land, following the failures of the previous Crusades, including the very controversial fourth one, which we won't get into. It also called for broader participation of Christians throughout Europe to be involved in the Crusades, and it outlined how it would be funded and organized. Then there was the church-state relations. The council addressed the authority, note this, because this directly bears on what we were talking about the relationship between the papacy and Anglicanism. The council addressed the authority of the church over secular rulers and reaffirmed papal supremacy in spiritual matters. So, we have tension with the Magna Carta. All right. Now, major outcomes. This is where I'm going to go over this quickly, and then we're going to come back to it. So, canon number one, we're going to look at canon number one and canon number three more closely than the others, because canon number one deals with transubstantiation, canon number three deals with heresy, and there were two groups. I only mentioned one at that time, but we're going to mention the second one. So the first canon deals with the Catholic faith of the doctrine of transubstantiation, and it affirms this core doctrine of the church, amongst others. It also affirmed the Trinity, doctrine of creation, the doctrine of the Incarnation, and it clarified transubstantiation. And it explicitly defines that Christ is truly present in the bread and the wine, because they become his body and blood physically. And that's the difference between substance, what the reality of the bread and the wine are, and accidens, accidens. I don't know how many people say accidents. It's not accidents. It is not a car wreck. They are accidens. Accidens comes from the Aristotelian Greek concept of elements, the externals. The bread and the wine are the externals, but the substance, the reality, Rome asserts, becomes the actual physical body and blood of Christ. And this becomes and became and is a central tenet of Roman theology to this day. They strove to impress upon everybody annual confession and communion. Sounds odd when you say annual communion, but all Christians were required to confess their sins at least once a year and receive the Eucharist during Easter. So it's not that they were saying, oh, by the way, it's only one time during the year where you have to take communion. What they're saying is that you at least have to do it during Easter. Unfortunately, there was such a hyper-mysticism that took place that reverence went overboard, and most parishioners, at least on the continent, slowly began to only receive communion on Easter and maybe Christmas. This is one of the things the Reformation addresses. Then there was the reform of the clerical life. The council issued a number of decrees on the moral conduct and discipline of clergy, addressing simony. This one always cracks me up. Concubinage. See, that's part of our orders. You get a collar and a broad. And other abuses. Welcome to the Middle Ages. I don't know. And then there was the regulation of heresy, and there were two that were addressed. They had been around for a little bit, but first I talked about the Cathars or the Cathari. The other one was the Waldensians, and I'll define those in just a second. And Canon 3, in dealing with these heresies, not just these two, but heresies in general, lays out the proper prescription for how secular authorities were supposed to punish them. Notice, once again, the state under the church. And this is where the Inquisition reigns supreme. It strongly condemned heresy, outlined penalties for heretics and their supporters, and the council supported the use of secular authorities in persecuting heretics, laying the ground. Well, I just said that. Then it dealt with the relationship between Christians and non-Christians, and in this case, Jews and Muslims. And I want you to listen very carefully to what the Fourth Lateran Council says, because this particular mentality in the 1200s affected us all the way down to the 1900s. The council restricted or enacted restrictive laws on Jews and Muslims in Christian societies, including requiring them to wear distinctive clothing. It was illegal to charge excessive interest on loans, and it banned them from holding public office over Christians. So you can see how this sets the stage for the Inquisition, and how curious minds can go back in history and implement this and say, oh, I don't know, the 1930s Germany? History is a very, very fickle mistress. She does things at one point that all of a sudden raise their head at other points by unscrupulous people who like to misuse her previous pronouncements. It dealt with the Crusades. The council planned the Fifth Crusade, which was launched in 1217, aiming to reclaim the Holy Land. And it called on European leaders to unite and participate in that campaign. So, up in arms, everybody, Christian soldiers, let's go to the Middle East. It dealt with church administration, the strengthening of the central authority of the Pope. It identified all of the major cities, Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, etc. But of course, Rome became number one. And it established procedures for episcopal elections and clarified ecclesiastical jurisdictions. Essentially what it did, it went back to Nicaea and came down a little bit more firmly on the tenets of Nicaea. And if we ever get a chance to go through the Nicene the Council of Nicaea, we'll talk about what those canons are. The historical significance overall is the Fourth Lateran Council. As I said, it's considered the most important medieval council, and it sets the stage for the Council of Trent. It marked a high point of papal authority, and it set the direction for the Church for centuries. And many of its canons remain foundational in Roman law and practice. Now, I'm going to talk about the two heresies first. The first one was the Cathars, or the Catharai, which comes from the Greek pure ones, or to purify. It was based upon Neoplatonic doctrine, and it saw that the material world was evil. So if you understand that, you should immediately go to Colossians and 1 John and read that in reference to what the apostles said about the physical world and the physical nature of Jesus, because to deny that the material world was good, to say it is evil, creates a massive problem with the incarnation, and that's one of the problems that the Catharai had. Plato called the human body, the physical body, the prison house, or the storehouse of the prison house is actually more closely aligned with what he meant. The prison house of the soul. And his philosophy, and the whole point of philosophy post-Plato, was to release the body from the confines of the restrictions of the evil physical world. Much different than, and God created the heavens and the earth and said it was good. The Catharai were essentially, if you haven't picked it up on it, they were Gnostics. They were neo-Gnostics, okay? They posited or identified that two gods existed. So in this sense, they had this kind of Near Eastern Manichaean sense of Gnosticism, where there were two competing deities. And I hate to say this, but if you talk to your average Christian, you're going to get it from your average secular person. They think that that's what we experience today in the world. How many movies have you seen, just as an example, since it is a reflection on the culture? How many movies have you seen where the core theme of the movie is good versus evil? I mean, this is a modernized, glossed over representation of Manichaeanism or Gnosticism, where you have two competing gods, one good god, one bad god, and they fight for us. Why, I don't know, but they fight for us. The first creator was the creator of the spiritual realm, as seen in the New Testament. So he's the good God, yay. And then the second one was a demiurge, a kind of God who was, if we go through maybe one of these days I'll teach a lesson on the Council of Nicaea, because all of this comes into play actually there. But a demiurge, whom they called the Rex Mundi, the king of the world, the king of the earth. And he was the God that created the physical world, and naughty, bad guy, should never have done that. And there's a whole scheme as to how this takes place. Somebody breaks off from somebody, who breaks off from somebody, who breaks off from somebody, well, all of this list. If you really want to get into it, read Irenaeus Against Heresies, because he lists all of the demiurges, all of them. And just a note on the accuracy and the trustworthiness of the Church Fathers. For 1900 years, Irenaeus' depiction of Gnosticism and the demiurges was repudiated by almost every scholar, academic scholar. I mean, the conservatives, we kind of went, okay, yeah, I guess. until they found the Nag Hammadi Library in 1947. They find the Nag Hammadi Library, and oh, guess what they find? They find Gnostic writings. Oh, and guess what happens? It was as if Irenaeus had that text while he was writing against heresies, because it matched up perfectly. So no question, when it comes to critiquing heresies, when it comes to critiquing other positions that are viewed aberrant from Christianity, don't give short shrift to the fathers. Christology could not happen because the material world was evil. They rejected the resurrection of Christ. Okay, so why are you even a Christian? They identified John the Baptist with the spirit of Elijah, and he was evil, sent to hinder Jesus' teachings by forcing this concept of baptism. I just report the news, I don't make it. All right, there's more, but as you get the picture. These guys were not within the mainstream of orthodoxy. The other one were the Waldensians, and this is a bit different because there are virtually no extant documents of Peter Waldo. Yes, where's Waldo? Here he is. Well, nobody remembers where's Waldo. Okay.
It just wasn't that funny.
Wow.
What'd you say?
Wow.
No, I didn't hear it.
Wasn't it?
I don't want to hear it again. Tough guy. But anyway.
Too early.
Huh?
It's too early.
Oh, okay. But there are virtually no extant documents from the Waldensians. So all of the criticism we have only comes from one source, Rome. Doesn't mean that Rome is wrong, but it certainly should give us a jaundiced view of everything they say. And I'll read to you some of this because it does bear directly on us because of where the Waldensians wind up in later church history. Now, they were declared heretical not because of their view on monetary issues or apostolic poverty. I mean, the Franciscans have been doing that for years. Excuse me. They were declared heretical because they refused to recognize the prerogatives of local bishops over the content of their preaching. In other words, the Waldensians would say something, the bishops would say, stop saying that, and they would say, nope. And nor did they recognize standards about who was fit to preach, and you'll get to that in just a second. They saw themselves as a church within the church. They accepted the Trinity, they defended the Eucharist as well as the real presence. However, at least some of them started to move more towards what ultimately would become a Zwinglian view, if Zwingli actually ever held that view. They did teach the real presence. They affirmed, however, the necessity of priests for offering the Mass, that they be pure. So sinful priests could not celebrate the Mass, according to Waldensians. They held the early forms of the Mass. They sought to recover the early Christian liturgy. This should start to sound familiar to some people. And they contained a sevenfold repetition of the Lord's Prayer, which I wish we had actually a copy of, because that would have been wonderful to see, with the Eucharistic elements being consecrated through the sign of the cross, multiple signs of the cross. They observed a 40-day fast of Lent, and they practiced abstinence on Good Friday and on every Friday. So far it's like, what's the big deal? But they had a problem with infant baptism. And one of the writers critiquing them said, ablution water, which is given to infants, profits zilch. Nothing. So there was a there was a belief that one could be saved, or that infants could be saved without being baptized, which is kind of sketchy. They rejected auricular confession to priests. They rejected the practice of venerating the saints, the use of oaths, secular courts, and prayers for the dead. Again, not as bad as we might see it today. They believed in the atoning death and justifying righteousness of Christ. They affirmed the Godhead, the fall of man, the incarnation of the Son of God. They denied purgatory. They elevated the value of voluntary poverty, and perhaps what would become a core element much later on. They believed in the universal priesthood of all believers, and they claimed that all good men are priests. So if you're familiar with any of your Baptist or non-denominational friends, you can see where this comes in. So if you're looking at them, they are generally considered to be proto-Protestants. That's how they're viewed. And I'm going to skip over a lot of this, but in the 16th century, the Waldensians were absorbed into the Protestant movement under the influence of the Swiss reformer Heinrich Bullinger. And Bullinger is significant simply because his work became the standard for many, many years in training Anglican priests during the 15th, 16th centuries, 17th centuries. So the fact that he would incorporate the Waldensians into the Swiss Reformation becomes incredibly significant. Okay, now I'm going to go back and we're going to talk about the real fun one. This is the one that's going to get everybody's hair to stand on edge. You can now turn that over. Now, I'm going to show this book so that everybody can see it. It's called Dogmatic Theology for the Laity. It is published by Tan Publications. The author is the Reverend Matthias Prem. And Tan Publications is one of, if not the most conservative Roman publishing houses in the United States, if not the world. Okay? So these are not whack job liberation theologians. And this book has, Judge, can you confirm that it has the nihil obstat and the imprimatur? A little bit louder?
Yes.
So this has been viewed by the bishops. It has been determined that there is nothing standing in the way of it being affirmed by the church, read by the congregation, and it has the imprimatur to be published and taught. Now I'm going to read to you what this particular text says. Mind you, this is recognized by official Roman dogma. He says, at the Last Supper, Christ offered himself as a victim to his Father in heaven, under the species of bread and wine, in which he was truly present. If we look in our missal, which he spelled wrong, but okay, we find the same words and actions described as in the Last Supper, in the middle of the canon, or at the time of creation, consecration. We read the following quote. The evening before his passion, Jesus took bread, into his holy and venerable hands. And the italicized, emboldened phrase was done by me so that you know that this is a rubric. Here the priest takes the bread into his hands, just as Jesus did. After raising his eyes to heaven, this is Jesus, the priest does the same thing. He blessed the bread, the priest blesses the bread, and he says, "Take and eat this, all of you, for this is my." Pay very close attention to the next sentence. These are the words of the priest. He does not say, "This is the body of Christ," but "This is my body." The same thing happens at the consecration of the wine, finally, as if he were Christ himself speaking. We call this in persona Christi. The priest also adds the word, "Do this in remembrance of me." The priest no longer exists as an individual person. He has turned into a sacramental sign, the representative of Christ, present upon the altar and offering himself in sacrifice. This is one of the reasons you don't hear me ever recite the Orate Fratris. Pray, brethren, that my sacrifice and yours be acceptable. There is no sacrifice we could ever offer during the Mass that would ever be acceptable to God, because the only thing we bring is sin. That's it. No matter how good anything we do, it'll always be tainted. Continuing, Christ is the real priest. It is he who has consecrated bread into his body, wine into his blood, and offers both as a sacrificial gift to the Heavenly Father. The holy sacrifice of the Mass is a sacrifice in the true sense of the word, just as the prophet Malachias prophesied in the Old Testament, and I have some additional Roman sources, all with the nihil obstat and imprimatur, that validate that position. That in and of itself is why I am not and could never be Roman Catholic. There is no sacrifice of the priest at the altar. That completely denies the once for all sufficient oblation of Jesus Christ on the cross. The priest does not become Christ. This isn't some type of modalistic kabuki theater. The priest is a priest. He is consecrated. He is ordained. He is set aside to do a certain work with all of his flaws and gifts. But he only stands before you or the altar because of Christ. That's it. This is the doctrine that was confirmed and basically dogmatized in the Fourth Lateran Council, and Trent went even further by anathematizing anyone who rejected this. The Fourth Lateran Council concluded this, outside of which transubstantiation, outside of which belief in transubstantiation, there is no possibility of salvation. Okay. Questions?
Can you explain what you mean by anathematizing?
You're condemned to hell.
I know that.
Well, that's what it means. No, I am not condemning you to hell, you know. Anathema means essentially to cut off.
That cuts
Do you want the
off-
literal, do you want the
That
literal?
cuts you off from the sacraments and from everything.
Yeah, the literal,
Okay.
the literal definition as used by Paul in Galatians is, if you have children, make sure they don't hear this, it means to emasculate yourself. You are emasculated. You are completely and utterly ruined. You are cut off. You are doomed. If you do not believe this doctrine, you are doomed for eternal perdition. End of story. Yeah, I knew this was I knew this was going to be hard, but this is what was said, and this is one of the reasons we have to be very careful in how we speak when we talk about what Anglicanism is, especially when people accuse us of being Roman. We do not believe this, or transubstantiation in any modified form. What are you going to say, Ted?
Oh, I just said it seems
Okay.
a little over the top.
Yeah, just a bit. But it has the nihil obstat and the imprimatur, so as far as Rome's concerned, hey, that's good stuff.
Transubstantiation is a specific, it's like a subset within real presence.
Yeah, the category that we always address is real presence. The question is how you define real presence. That's what the argument is.
Whether you define it.
Or whether you define it at all, yeah. That's very true. There are some that don't offer an explanation. I mean, that was Elizabeth's position. Elizabeth's position is it's a mystery, I don't know. And I just leave it. She actually wrote a little poem. I don't remember the poem off the top of my head, but she wrote a little poem, you know, the bread into my hands I take, the wine to the cup I drink, and beyond that, it was like, I don't know and I don't care because I am receiving my Christ. And it would behoove all of us to actually adhere to that if more consistently. Look, I understand the need to protect against error, but that's something different. It's much in akin, and since we all essentially within the West identify with the Augustinian tradition, it's the way Augustine used to deal with differences in, or even in the discussion of various doctrinal positions, especially as it revolved around the Godhead. He always functioned more on the via negativa, on the negative, rather than the affirmative, he said, because it's always easier to say what God is not than it is to try and get into the Godhead and affirmatively define the characteristics of God. We are limited by our finitude to define an infinite God. So we have to be very careful. It's not to say that we are not supposed to understand what we can understand about who God is. But we shouldn't push the boundaries, and this is part of the problem that we have in various Christian circles. People become too rationalistic. My Presbyterian brethren have a tendency to do that. They want to chop everything down to the nub so that we can have the fullest understanding of it. That does more damage than good, because ultimately along the way, you're not going to come to a 100% accurate description anyway. It's just not going to happen because you're finite. But it also winds up isolating and eliminating people that probably don't need to be isolated or eliminated. Anyway, I'll stop because I can go on and on. Michelle, you had a question, and better not be about my jokes.
Sorry about that. So everything that's parentheses in here are your work?
No,
No, which ones are yours? The bold ones?
no. I said I have bolded them because they're rubrics.
Okay, so you didn't put anything in there?
No, I didn't add anything.
Okay. Can you just...
You want me to read it? I'll read it to you.
No, it's not
Oh,
that I
okay.
don't believe you.
All right.
I just don't quite understand.
What is it that you don't understand?
So
I can explain it in
okay.
3 minutes or less.
Okay, so Roman Catholics believe that when the priest is doing this, he is basically becoming Christ.
Okay, let me sharpen the discussion. The average Catholic in the pew has no clue that this is what Rome teaches. Zero. Because the average Catholic in the pew would not buy a Roman theological textbook. They just won't. Because Rome teaches fide simplicitus. Rome teaches that by faith you implicitly trust your priest. And you trust that he is going to represent what the church has ordained him to teach the congregation. So, does the average Catholic in the pew believe that? I would dare say probably no, because they don't even know it exists. This is for wonks like me who have to do graduate work, and I have to read this stuff and go gray at a young age, because I actually read this stuff. When I came across this while I was doing my master's in theology, one of my master's in theology. While I was doing my THM, I had to do a comparison of the three views of the Eucharist: the Eastern view, the Roman view, and the Protestant view. And the Protestant view is a mess, because it's like go to your neighborhood church on the street and they'll have something different than the one across the street. But anyway, so I did that. And when I was researching the Roman view, I went to my favorite publisher, 10 Books, a Tridentine publisher, and they have that actually, and as their part of their charter, that they are staunchly a defender of the Council of Trent. And I said, well, this is going to be good. This is official Roman stuff. And then I saw the Nihil Obstat, the Imprimatur, and I said, okay, I can't go wrong here. I'm in like Flint. And then I read this and I almost vomited. I sent this quote. I've sent this quote to half a dozen people, and I get the same reaction from everybody. I don't believe that. Where did you get that? That's the same reaction. I sent that to my bishop, my archbishop, when I was doing my master's degree. I said, you need to read this. I don't believe that. Where'd you get that? And so now you see why I have the citations at the bottom, and why I showed you the book, and why I told you about the Nihil Obstat and the Imprimatur. Because unless you know that it has been officially accepted by the Roman Church, you're going to call me a liar. So I'm just CYA right now.
This explains to me why many Catholics that I've listened to and otherwise call it the holy sacrifice of
Yep.
Mass.
Yes, that's exactly why, because it is a sacrifice. So, the second part of your question, to answer that, is, do they believe that the priest actually becomes Christ? Probably not, but that's what is being taught. That's what they don't know, nor do they understand. And please do not go to your Roman friends and show them this, not because I'm trying to keep anything secret, but because you are going to hurt them. This would devastate them. And it's not that I'm trying to cover up error, I am not, but people in their Christian life are at various stages of their ability to accept certain Christian truths. I wouldn't take an individual who just immediately identified themselves as a Christian and start to lecture them on the relationship between predestination, election, and the atonement. Because their little heads would explode and they would go running screaming from the church. And much the same as this. If somebody engages you in a conversation and they ask you, so, why is it that you don't accept Roman teaching? And you can say, well, I don't accept transubstantiation. And if they're astute, if they're at least informed, they'll say, oh, why? What's wrong with transubstantiation? Then, if you want, you can bring this up.
Talk about predestination.
Pardon me?
Talk about predestination.
I can't because it's time for morning prayer. Thank you, Lord. I don't have a problem talking about it, we just don't have the time. If you would like, I can do it. Well, no, we're gonna get to it, we're gonna get to it in the Bible study,
Okay.
in the New Testament. We will deal with it in the New Testament, and I promise you, we'll probably have to take about 3 weeks. But we will deal with it.